Welcome to Photojournalism Now in Conversation. I'm Alison Stuyvesant-Taylor. Today I'm talking with Robin Hammond, an award-winning visual journalist based in the UK. Welcome, Robin, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Alison. I'm flattered that you wanted to include me in this.
Robin, you and I have talked many times over the years, in particular in relation to photography and social change, which is the focus of my PhD. And we've talked a lot about the work that you're doing with your non-profit, WITNESSCHANGE. Today I'd like to start by having a chat about what's happening for you with coronavirus and how the lockdown has impacted the way you work, because I know that you spend much of your year travelling the world.
Well, everything's come to a complete stop. I should have been involved in a big project right now in Europe, which would have had me spend 3 months abroad. And so that's had to be postponed. And, I've been a photojournalist for 20 years. And I think probably in the last 12 years that most of that's been work abroad. And this is the most time I've spent in one place in that entire time.
So I guess in some ways that's not a bad thing because you've just become a new father, haven't you?
We had a little girl on the 13th of January. I guess it's hard to talk about silver linings when so many people are in such a difficult situation with this virus. But it's been a really amazing time to be able to spend this time with our little baby.
So I know that you're working on putting together a collection of pictures for the Carmagnac Photojournalism Awards 10th anniversary exhibition, which opens in Paris in July. So perhaps we can have a look at some of those pictures and you can talk us through what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, this was a really challenging story to tell. I was trying to capture both the devastation of this, decades of misrule under Robert Mugabe, but also why some people might feel they would support him. So, and it was really, the focus was mostly, though, on those who were the victims of this dictatorship. It was a difficult project. I spent 3 months in Zimbabwe. I had to spend a lot of time being very cautious about my surroundings. I knew that I was in a hostile environment and I wouldn't be welcome should it be discovered what I was doing there. But I had been in and out of Zimbabwe for several years previous to this, so I had a little bit of knowledge of the country, which helped. But it was a very interesting also exercise in understanding the relationship as an outsider versus insider. I know this is a big conversation within photojournalism, like who tells whose stories. And this was actually an interesting case where, as an outsider, I think I had greater access because I think that local people felt they were more able to trust someone from outside than someone from within their community, which gave me greater access, I think, to some really intimate moments. It's an amazing country with a tragic past and a beautiful people who've suffered terribly under this dictatorship. And so as we come to the series of portraits, maybe I should talk about that. One of the challenges with this work was I was talking about historical events, where there was no physical evidence. And as a visual storyteller, what do you do with it? How do you document something that you can't see? So rather than focusing on the events themselves, I started focusing on the people who lived through them. Or who were living through the consequences of them. And so I had intended at first to include portraits, but I started this series and, the idea being that, here are people emerging out of the darkness to tell their story often for the first time in their lives of what happened to them and what they were struggling to live with.
And you mentioned before that, that you had to be really careful about where you went and access, but you ended up spending some time in jail, didn't you, when you were doing this story?
Yeah, so as time went on, I guess I took greater and greater risks in order to try and tell the story in a deeper and deeper way. And on one of the last trips, I was following Zimbabweans who were illegally crossing the border to South Africa. So at the time, it was a country of 12 million people and perhaps 3 million had fled into South Africa seeking work because the country had just collapsed. And then, I came back to where I was staying. I found that the police were waiting for me. And so I was arrested and in the end I was charged with taking photographs in a prohibited place. So they found a photograph on my camera because they searched all my pictures that I'd taken as I crossed the border. And they said that was a militarily sensitive area and therefore they were charging me with that. And they said they were going to fine me, I think it was $150 and then deport me. And I was right on the border. I said, okay, fine, I'll pay my fine and then you can deport me. And they said, yeah, you pay your fine, but we can't deport you from here. We have to deport you from Harare, which is like, I don't know, about 400 kilometers north of the border. I was obliged to wait in the local prison for 2 weeks before they then drove a group of us up to Harare, where I stayed for a further 2 weeks. They deport, foreigners who have, in their eyes, committed crimes, but you have to pay for your own flight. So just that process of getting somebody to go to the immigration office and show them a ticket and get them approved, it took a very long time, but they were in no rush. I actually denied that I was a journalist, but they had a pretty firm idea of what I was doing, and this is just a way really to punish me for telling a story which they didn't really want it out there in the world.
And how did you get your pictures out?
A lot of foreign journalists have been arrested in Zimbabwe. Most of them not detained for an extremely long time, but I know that a lot of them have been arrested and had their materials taken from them. So throughout my trip, I was downloading everything on the hard drives and sending them out of the country. What was interesting about what I had on my camera, all I had on my camera from that trip was this series of people crossing the river on foot to get to South Africa. They made me delete 2 photographs, which was of me walking across the bridge to the border, which crosses the border. And then they gave me back my camera and let me go. If I wasn't living through it as a really difficult time, it's actually also very, very interesting. I had a friend who'd come up from South Africa to try and help me out, who was a Zimbabwean, and he had been talking a lot to the prosecutor about ways that we could maybe minimize my sentence or get me out earlier. And when I was in the jail of the courthouse, he came down to me and said, "Is this your camera?" And I said, "Well, yeah, it's my camera." He said, "Do you want it back?" I said, "I do." He said, "Well, because it's your camera and you use it to commit a crime, we will be confiscating this camera from you. So I ask you again, is this your camera?" And I said, "No, it's my friend's." He said, "Okay, then we'll give it back to you after you finish your prison time." The conversations, obviously, that my friend had with him were able to convince him that to at least get my camera back. So I got my camera back with all but 2 pictures.
That was a really amazing outcome. It could have been quite different, couldn't it?
I would have been upset to have lost those pictures, but it was literally 2 or 3 days of work, and I was grateful to have had this happen after I'd completed 3 months of work and got 99% of what I wanted to do.
Let's move on to talk about Witness Change and some of the work that you're doing through your non-profit. I wanted to talk specifically about these beautiful, emotive portraits of elderly Japanese men and women who are suffering from dementia. Can you tell me a little bit about this series?
I was really unexpectedly moved by doing this series. And first of all, I went in there to document the way that people were living with dementia. And, basically I was there to document the condition and the treatment around it. And then, of course, it may seem obvious, but I came across these people who were at the heart of this issue. And like a lot of my work, I flipped around to focus on the people living through it rather than, the human rather than the condition. And I was very struck as well by these people and their stories, also where they had come from, where they have ended up. And I think also what's sort of interesting about, and one of the ideas behind about them holding photographs or items from their past is, for many of them, that is the past in which they are living in now. Their work or their home life as if it's what's going on now. But also, I think what was also interesting to me is that, I think that often older people are just not seen. If we can try to remember that they are, in a way, they are us. They are who we will be.
This portrait here with the older woman and the pitchfork, when I was having a look at that photograph and I was looking at her face and her demeanour and then looking at this rudimentary pitchfork, and there was a real disconnect for me between, what the story was, what was going on there. And it wasn't until I read the account and understood that, she'd spent a lot of her life on a farm and working outdoors was something that was integral to who she was, how she identified. And then that sort of narrative started to make sense to me. Can you tell me a little bit about this person?
I actually got sent recently a picture of me with her, and she is this tiny woman. But even in the home where she is now, she goes out and gardens every day. And what I think is interesting about some of the places I visited in Japan is that it's fundamental to their care that they are involved in maintaining their daily life. They will be given activities up to whatever their capacity is or what their interests are. But and it's actually not an especially efficient way to run the house because, it'd just be quicker if a cleaner or a gardener came and did it. But it gives them that sense of purpose.
What's the reaction been like to this work?
I want to say fairly muted at first. Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that I did this work in the Netherlands, in the UK, and in Japan. And I did it with the Guardian magazine. And the Guardian magazine ran the work only from the UK and the Netherlands. And then, sometimes this happens with publications, they divided up the work and they ran a separate story from Japan about the care system in Japan. And they didn't run any of the portraits. So actually, the portraits, these pictures that you're seeing now, have not been formally published in any publication. And then just recently, someone who runs a blog on age-related issues asked to share the work and write about it. And that's been really, the response from people who are interested in that field has been really positive. It's been really overwhelming, actually. I think it was unfortunate, for me at least, that the Guardian bypassed on running this, that they ran the reportage pictures from Japan, but not these portraits. But, it's one of those things as a photographer, I think it's an unfortunate thing is that power structures in publications are such that we often don't have a say. And that's also why it's great to be able to have our own social media accounts and our own ways of publishing our own stories in the way that we feel they deserve to be seen. So Instagram is one of our main ways to be able to reach audiences. So we take the content which we publish on the website. So we have a couple of different websites. Three actually. We've got the WITNESSCHANGE.org site, we've got onedayinmyworld.com, and we've got whereloveisillegal.com. So we have a different website for each of the projects. And so we take the content from the websites and we distribute it on Instagram and Facebook, but mostly Instagram. And so not only do we share stories, usually about individuals from those websites, but also we have a strong component of what we call user-generated content, which is basically people from around the world who somehow relate to the issues that we're talking about and want to share their own stories. So we get sent stories all the time from all over the place. In this case, people who are living with mental health issues or have a living with a relative or caring for someone with mental health issues, who feel like they can contribute somehow by sharing their stories. Contribute to the narrative, but also I think for some of them it's cathartic to be able to speak about what they're going through as well. And I think that what's probably important to sort of underline about both of these issues that mental health and LGBT issues is that in many cases the narrative of these people's lives are not controlled by the people living them. And I think that this is actually the greater principle of witness change is that so much of our lives are about stories. They're about stories we tell each other and the stories we tell ourselves, and our stories are our beliefs. And what's fundamental, we believe at least, is that when we're talking about marginalized groups, those marginalized groups are heard within those stories. I think with around mental health issues, is often there may be an attitude of, well, people with mental illness don't have the ability to talk about themselves. And sometimes it is the case, but in a lot of cases, people with mental health issues are absolutely capable of talking about, articulating what they're going through. And, if you consider that 1 in 4 of us in the world will have a mental health issue from, all the way from anxiety to schizophrenia and everything in between, it's absolutely vital that it's not just a story told by journalists or not just told by mental health professionals, but also by the people who are living those experiences. And that, I say that, and I think that it seems like really obvious, but it doesn't always happen, right? So many marginalized groups, their stories are about them rather than coming from them. So this is an attempt to try and have that narrative somehow have them take back control of it. We always want to check back in with people and double check that they're okay to share it and have them understand that, when it goes out into the social media world, we don't necessarily have control over how people will react to it. For people from the LGBT community, there's definitely a high possibility that people will not react well to seeing someone from the LGBT community express themselves, just because obviously the level of hate, sadly, is still so great around the world. But I have to say that from our user-generated content, I don't think there's been anyone who said, "Oh yeah, actually no, I don't want to share my story because that might happen." Most of them are well aware and are happy to share. But we always want to check back in because the last thing we want to do is cause somebody further harm by what someone else says on social media.
I'd like to share the video that you sent me on the workshop that you conducted with the Rohingya.
I'm a firm believer, and I think this has become a much greater realization, or much greater sensitivity to who is telling the story. I am very sensitive to the fact that in pretty much all my work, I'm an outsider, and outsiders telling the stories of marginalized groups or groups over which they have some form of power has not always turned out so well, I think, for those marginalized groups in history. So I think that it's really important that I don't think that outsiders shouldn't tell those stories. I think that there's a great contribution that outsiders can play, and especially where they have knowledge and understanding and sensitivity, it can create a great contribution. And also, many outsiders like myself have a particular storytelling expertise which we can offer towards a situation. But I think that much more we need to be able to support marginalized groups to tell their own stories. I think that's got to be a big future of storytelling.
Let's take a look at one of the workshops that Robin and his team ran for Where Love is Illegal.
Where Love's Illegal should not just be about the LGBT community, but also should be coming from the LGBT community. We thought that maybe if we can enable local LGBT communities to be able to tell stories more effectively, maybe they could be the ones to push forward their cause. Where Love is Illegal is a platform for telling LGBT stories of survival from around the world. We started doing Where Love is Illegal workshops because we were aware that our audience, while really responsive and really supportive, was mostly not in the communities where we were working. And while we think it's really important to be able to reach the international community and people who can influence donors and policymakers and human rights organizations, we really wanted to be able to have an impact on the ground where we work. We wanted to somehow interact with the local community in a way that would hopefully make their situation better.
If you want to do a portrait, it should help get a little bit more of the light. The workshops are led by us, but they're meant to create content and a campaign that can help people on the ground in the countries we're working. That's why for the workshop, we gave cameras to the people we worked with. We talked about how to tell stories, both with still pictures and with video and interviews. And we sent them out back into their community to try to share their own stories. Interview each other, interview their friends, interview other people, and then come back. We do a critique of their work, talk about what's working, what's not, what we love.
I think it's really great to be able to see this quick evolution of the students from when they step in with little understanding of the power of photography or the ability for it to be able to communicate their lived experience. And then by the end of the workshop, you see some of the most amazing stories. And it's interesting to see it because sometimes I think that they don't understand themselves how powerful their stories are.
More than anything, I hope it helps them be better advocates for themselves. If they can learn some skills about how to better represent themselves in their community and advocate for their rights, that's an ideal situation.
I think that sometimes it's the smallest of tools that we give them that have really, really great impacts on them being able to share their story in a really powerful way.
Of course, coronavirus and travel restrictions means that Robin is now going to do workshops remotely.
We've only just started doing these completely remote ones, and in one of the next projects that I'm going to be doing, which is a mental health focused project, where it's going to be a very big remote workshop where we will be sending cameras to people in different countries and then teaching them how to use them, and then just doing everything else we would usually do in an in-person workshop. It works, but it's much harder. I mean, as great as Zoom and Skype and all these things are, especially when you have someone who's maybe learning in another language, to try to ensure that they have full understanding of what you're trying to get across, and to show them how to hold a camera, or to show them sort of basic rules of composition. It's just much harder remotely. So what we're having to do is just spend more time. And I think if we could, we'd do them all in person. But just the situation is such that we can't.
So Robin, where to next?
I'm doing a couple of projects around mental health. One in Europe, one in Africa, which is going to be about the long-term impacts of post-traumatic stress disorder and how PTSD can perpetuate conflict. I'm doing another big project in a lot of different West African countries, which was as a result of a grant from National Geographic Society. I've already done that work in 3 countries, and I probably have another 3 countries to do, but that work is obviously on hold right now. But I've just been very fortunate that the funders they get that we can't do the work right now. So as soon as we can get on a plane, that work will continue. To be honest, most of my time is childcare.
That's lovely that you have time to spend with your new baby. Thanks again for sharing your beautiful images and the important work that Witness Change is doing. And thanks too to everyone for watching Photojournalism Now in Conversation. My next interview is with Pulitzer Prize-winning American photojournalist Renee Seebeyer.